Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Let's learn about international relations. Today's topic is the rise of China. So what we're curious about is whether China is going to kill us anytime soon. And very conveniently, the timing of this video is perfect because there's a new movie coming out on Wednesday. It's called Red Dawn, and Red Dawn is the story of a secret Chinese plot to destroy the United States and a resistance movement that spawns in Washington state to combat the Chinese invasion. Now, while movies are silly, some Americans are actually really concerned that China is going to be more and more belligerent. It's growing in stature, it's growing in power, and if that's the case, then in the future, we should expect China to, push its weight around a little bit more, and that's true, and that's concerning. But should we actually be worried about a really serious Chinese threat, like a Chinese invasion? And if so, should we launch preventive war? If you think back to our unit on the rationality of war, we know that if a rising state is growing more powerful, it's going to get a lot of concessions in the future. And if you're a declining state, then you might actually be better off fighting a really costly war than to making those concessions in the future. And so if we're going to apply that theory to policy practice, then what this is saying is that maybe we should consider launching a preventative war against China right now, fighting China to the death, and quashing China before it becomes a bigger problem later. And while that is a theoretical possibility, in practice that seems like a poor idea because if we actually think about this, this is not going to be wise. And here's why. Here's why preventative war won't work. Preventative war only works if the costs of war are small, and that's not going to be the case here. It's stupid to fight a preventative war for a variety of reasons. Reason number one is that China has nuclear weapons. It's not exactly a smart idea, and we haven't gone over nuclear weapons yet. We'll be doing that in a future unit, but it's not a smart idea to fight a country that has nuclear weapons when those nuclear weapons from that country could just be shot right back at you. That's a bad idea. That's going to make war really costly for you. Preventative war is only smart if it's not going to be costly. Well, China having nuclear weapons is going to make it costly. Oops, number two is that the United States and China exchange $500 billion in trade every year. And going back to the unit on trade, we know that we like trade, we know that trade is a good thing, and we know from the capitalist piece that when we're trading a lot, then we're benefiting from that trade, and that makes war less attractive. And so if we're talking about preventative war only being attractive if it's not very costly, $500 billion every year in trade is going to be lost if you go to war. So again, that doesn't seem like a good idea. That seems like preventative war is going to be very costly. Another big problem is if you thought Iraq was bad, China has over 1 billion people. And so fighting a war where we're trying to invade a country and something like that is not going to work out very well when you have to combat perhaps 1 billion people. So what we can conclude here is that preventative war is not an option. China is going to rise in power, and there's basically nothing that the United States can really do to stop that, short of doing something that's even stupider, like fighting a preventative war. But on the other hand, we shouldn't exactly be worried that China is going to take us over. And if you think that, then, my suggestion is that you need your head examined. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So reason number one is that China also enjoys trading with us. What I said about that $500 billion goes both ways. China's not going to want to fight a war against the United States to lose out on that trading surplus. That's a lot of money that's being exchanged hands, and China likes that quite a bit. And I think that the most indicative part of this, what you can see this most clearly in, is actually that movie Red Dawn, because I lied a little bit earlier. It's not actually the story of a secret Chinese plot to destroy the United States. It originally was a secret Chinese plot to destroy the United States, but then the producers decided that they'd actually want to sell the movie in that Chinese market, because remember, China's got 1 billion people. That's a lot of people that could go see the movie. And so in post-production, the producers changed the plot so that it wasn't a Chinese invasion, it was a North Korean invasion. And so the producers essentially erased all the Chinese flags and replaced them with North Korean flags, and erased all the Chinese emblems and replaced them with North Korean emblems and that sort of thing. And so what's really interesting here is that by virtue of the fact that the producers were willing to change this plot fact or this plot feature, that's indicative of the fact that such a Chinese invasion is just patently absurd and silly, because we're so concerned, both sides are so concerned about this economic relationship that there's no way that China would ever go ahead and invade the United States when we're so concerned that we're actually willing to change an entire movie plot just to sell the movie in China. So that's interesting. Oops number two is that China essentially owns us already. China is one of the big contributors to United States publicly held debt. And in fact, China holds $1.1 trillion of U.S. debt. So why would you do this if you were China, if you were then planning on taking over the United States? That would be the equivalent of Apple purchasing Microsoft, paying $1 trillion or something like that to purchase Microsoft. And then after completing that purchase, after giving Microsoft $1 trillion, then Apple would launch an invading army into Washington and take over Microsoft. That's really stupid business practices. You don't go pay trillions of dollars to purchase something, and then after you've completed your purchase, you go send an army to take it over when you've already bought it anyway. It doesn't really make sense for China to go ahead and stage a war against the United States when China is essentially going to be getting payoffs from the United States for a long time into the future because China holds all of this U.S. debt. Another problem is that we have nuclear weapons. It's the same problem that China faces, or we face with China if we were thinking about launching a preventative war in China. And then, of course, China, is seeing what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan and knows that going and trying to invade a country really isn't a very good idea when that country has a lot of guns. So the conclusion that you can draw here is that there's no communist takeover to be expected in the United States anytime soon. Now, that being said, it's definitely true that China is going to be getting stronger over time, and you just have to take a look at GDP to see this. So this is GDP in the United States in 1990. That was at $5.8 trillion. In 1990, the United States was first in the world. China was significantly far behind. That's $390 billion in 1990, which ranked China 10th in the world. If we fast forward to about today, in 2011, the United States' GDP about tripled to $15 trillion, still first in the world. But you can see that China just skyrocketed here. This is a huge jump. It went from 390 billion in 1990 to 11 trillion in 2011, jumping from 10th in the world to the second in the world. And when you have all this extra money floating around, you have more tax revenue, which means you can purchase more guns, more weapons, perhaps an aircraft carrier or two. Those are things that you can do when you have a lot of money that you can't really do when you don't have a lot of money. And so by virtue of the fact that China is expanding its economy, China is going to be a stronger player in the world. And in fact, if we project this a little bit further, if we look into 2050, so fast forward about 40 years, what's going to happen? Well, the United States will move up to $83 trillion in GDP. That'll actually place it third in the world. Meanwhile, China is going to be first in the world in 2050 with a GDP of $205 trillion. Of course, India will be in between the United States and China at that point in 2050. So that's a huge difference now where China is going to leapfrog us and go into first place in world GDP, or at least in GDP production per country. Now, this is not the full story, however. Let's take a look at GDP per capita. This is a big difference. China has its own problems here. The United States in 2011 had a per capita GDP of $48,000, which is pretty good. It's actually sixth in the world. So if we look at every individual in the United States, if we look at how much the United States makes in terms of GDP and look at that per individual, $48,000 per individual in the United States in 2011. That's pretty darn good. China, in contrast, is horrible. The GDP per capita is $8,300, and that ranks China 92nd in the world. Its peers are Ecuador and Belize. So China has its own domestic problems here that aren't going to be easily resolved by just growing a larger economy. So to conclude, what we've learned here is that we have to accept that China will play a more prominent role in international affairs. That's just a fact of life because we can't effectively launch a preventative war against China, and China is going to be growing economically stronger, and they're going to turn that eventually into military capacity as well. That's the downside. The bright side is that both countries, China and the United States, are so preoccupied with our economic relationship that it's ultimately not going to be too big of a deal. And of course, looming around in the background here is that China has this huge domestic problem with this GDP per capita issue that is not going to go away anytime soon, and that's something that China is going to have to address domestically before it can start projecting power internationally. So why did we cover this? Well, if we thought that the democratic peace theory was really what was going to cause peace between two countries, then we'd be concerned that the rise of China could cause war between the United States and China. But on the other hand, if we believe in the capitalist piece, and that's essentially what's going on here, if we believe in the capitalist piece, then the trade between the United States, that economic relationship between the United States and China, is essentially going to produce peace between the United States and China, despite the fact that we're seeing a power transition where the United States is growing comparatively weaker and China is growing comparatively stronger vis-a-vis the United States. So, in conclusion, China, yeah, it's going to be bigger, it's going to be badder, but it's not going to be so depressing for the United States that it's going to make you want to cry at night. Don't have to worry about it in too much detail. But that's something to keep in mind, and I think this was helpful in seeing how we can actually use theory and put it into practice with something relevant. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed this look at the relationship between the United States and China. I hope you've enjoyed this entire unit on the democratic peace theory and associated theories, and we are done with this unit, and in the next unit we're going to pick up on something related where we're going to talk about principal agent problems that happen within a country and how that affects international outcomes. So I hope you enjoyed all of this, and I will see you in the next unit. Take care.